we need to get some really nice shots of our beautiful new Tachibana origami planes taking some shavings. That's probably the best part of my job. However, to get them there, I need to set one of these planes up. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to do a small plane tuning video, but really with a focus on setting up this particular plane, the Tachibana. When you buy a Japanese plane, you buy a number of things. As you go up in price range, you should also go down in tolerances. So as you spend a little bit more on a Japanese plane, what we should find, theoretically, and there are many exceptions to this, is that we get a plane that's a little bit easier to set up. So I'm going to be setting up 48mm blue paper steel Tachibana today. We're going to put a bit of a timer on it to get a bit of an indication. Unfortunately, setting up one plane is not the same as setting up another plane that came in the same batch, and certainly not the same as setting up a plane that came in a completely different batch. However, knowledge is power, so we'll just get a little bit of it and we'll be a bit wiser for it. Here I've got probably what I would consider as the basic tools for setting up a Japanese plane, and there are many variations on these specific tools, but this is what I use to get my planes tuned, and if you come to a sharpening night at the JTA workshop, you'll probably see these on the bench and you'll get to use them. So, got a sink with some water stones here. The brand is not so important. Certainly 1000 grit, certainly at 1 or 2 higher. We have a Kanna, a steel lapping plate, which will lap out the back of the blade. We've got some diamond stones for flattening, and that's the blade taken care of over here. As far as fitting the blade to the block and taking care of the block, we've got sandpaper on glass in a couple of iterations. We've got some files for dealing with the tuning of the blade in the block. We have a metal file in case we need to deal with anything to do with the chip breaker. We have a nice sharp chisel which will come in handy for a couple of things. We have the specialist Tachibana, which is the plane block tuning plane. However, this is not completely necessary. You can do this job with many other tools. We have a straight edge that we trust that we're going to use to read what's going on with the block. And we have a couple of mallet or a hammer. So the wooden mallet I've been using most recently to tune most of the planes in the shop, simply because I was worried about cosmetic damage arising from striking the blade and striking the block for planes that have to go on display here. However, we have an air conditioner in the shop, and what I found is that air conditioner has dried the blocks since it's been running, and those blocks have moved slightly, and because this gives you a fairly light set on a plane, those plane blades have been quite sensitive to that movement. So I'm going to be doing most of my tuning with this 300-gram hammer, which is a copper head. No, sorry, it's a brass head. So it's slightly softer than the steel in the top of the plane blade, I hope, and that should protect the plane blade from deforming too much under the strikes. So, let's start. The first thing I'm going to do is give the back of the blade a few passes on the Kanna to see what's going on. On this plane blade, the front 2 mils or so hasn't touched the Kanna across the entire edge, so I need to place my pressure right on the front of the bevel while lapping. Our Kanna are simple mild steel plates that have been milled flat, and my preferred method for lapping is to scrub a 1000 grit stone across the plate, leaving behind a nice thick slurry that will move plenty of metal. I like to refresh that slurry regularly to keep it aggressive. So after about 9 minutes of work on the Kanna, I have a uniform finish across the blade back. I'll wipe the slurry off the plate, add a fingertip of water to activate the abrasive that is left, and work the blade through again to generate a polish. After about 5 minutes of that, the blade back is lapped and polished, and I can do the same to the back of the chip breaker. So with about 20 minutes of work, I have a flat, polished back on both the main blade and the chip breaker. I'm very happy with that. I'm starting my sharpening process on the 1000 grit stone. Here I'm using the Sharpenings. I'm aiming for a flat, straight bevel on this first sharpen, so it's important to keep the stones nice and flat. I'm flattening throughout with the 400 grit Atoma diamond plate. After about 5 minutes of sharpening, the bevel is flat enough that it will do a bit of a handstand on the stone. This just means that its shape is beginning to mirror that of the stone. which is great if the stone is flat, but not so much fun if it's dished. I'm flattening regularly, so it should be a good sign. This blade has now been worked by the stone across the entire front edge. Further up the bevel, the sides haven't been touched, but they don't do any cutting, so I'm not worrying too much about them. Once I'm done with the main blade, I can give the chip breaker a few runs to make sure it has a front edge. I'm stepping up to the 2000 grit stone here, and once I'm done with that, I'll go through the 5000 and 12,000 grits. It's definitely not a must to buy and use every stone in a brand progression, but I've got the lot in the sink, it feels nice, and it's pretty efficient. Every time I go to a new stone, I like to flatten it off to make sure I know where I'm starting from. So here I have a blade that's very sharp, and it's time to fit the blade into the block. I'm covering the back and the sides with pencil to make sure that any contact between the blade and the block is going to show up early in the process. It would be a shame to adjust behind the blade if it is actually catching the sides instead. So the first of my firm setting hits are already bedding the blade slightly skewed. This could mean that there is an uneven pressure across the blade and that the block is pinching the blade on the side that is not dropping towards the mouth, or it could be catching in one of the side channels, so further inspection will be required. I'm going to take off just the high spots that the pencil has shown up, both from behind and to the sides of the blade, and go again. Too much pencil is never enough. Here we can see that as I wiggle the blade, there is a single point that it seems to pivot around, meaning that we have a high point here at the back. I'll be focusing my work here for a little bit. The file was moving very controllable amounts of material, but I wanted a bit more movement, so I went to the chisels instead. So having removed all of the darkened high spots, the blade is bedding and the wiggle seam's gone. Time to bed it, but it is still bedding slightly skewed. So, time to go again. The blade is getting close now, so I'm going to introduce the chip breaker to see how it's behaving. The chip breaker is too tight, so to drop it, I'm going to be filing the underside of the bar. It looks as though it is much tighter at the sides than in the middle, so I'll need to remove more material there. The Tachibana planes, as with many Kanna, are relieved behind the blade. The contact patch in front of the blade needs a bit of work. Looking across the block, we have a little bit of work to do. Interestingly, this block has a low point in the middle of the block in front of the blade, but the sides of the block are low behind the blade. I cover the sole with pencil so I can see what's coming into contact with the glass, and a few minutes over the sandpaper brings the main contact patches into coplanularity. Once the contact patches are established, I mark where I'll be removing a bit of material. So as we round the hour mark of the plane tuning session, I am about to put in the reliefs on the sole of the plane. I'm just going to go for a 2 contact patch plane. I don't really want to have that 3rd contact patch behind the blade, and I'm going to run the Dainaoshi Kanna across the grain. It takes a little bit of practice to run this right up to the blade because having 2 sharp bits of metal in close proximity is a bit scary. And after having that across the grain, I'm going to scrape down the grain with a sharp chisel. This is just smoothing out the timber, not removing a huge amount at this point. We just want some powder. The last thing I'm going to do before I'm happy to call this plane ready is tune the mimi. These are the corners of the blade. At the moment they are wider than the mouth opening, meaning that at the extreme edges the shaving will run into the timber of the blade holding slot and possibly jam the plane. Here I'm bringing the corners of the blade in to sit just at the edges of the plane mouth. There's not much metal to move, so I'm going to work the corners on a 320 grit stone and finish on 1000. That's much better. With the corners of the plane blade finally tuned, I can go ahead and take some shavings. I took about an hour and a half to tune this plane. I think it was an hour and 28 minutes in the end across 2 sessions, and I am really, really happy with it. It is a beautiful plane to use, takes a great shaving, cuts really cleanly, and I pretty much gave it hell for 40 minutes to an hour once I tuned it. Here I'm using it on macrocarpa as a smoother, and then I moved on to some walnut, and I used it across the grain on the walnut and down the grain to see how it would behave. And it kept cutting beautifully. Really, really happy with it. That's it from me. I hope your Tachibana Kanna gives you as many nice shavings as this one is giving me. See you in the shop.